Come to order. Good afternoon, Mr. Attorney General. We're delighted to have you back, and I want to begin by congratulating you and the department on the recovery of much of the ransomware from the attack on the Colonial Pipeline. That was excellent work, and I know everybody in the country really appreciates it, and hopefully it sends a message to those groups out there that would continue to hack our industries and our government. The complex and often difficult work of the department is vast. It ranges from national security investigations to operating a national prison system, management of billions in grants to state and local entities. And this year, the President's fiscal year 2022 budget request for the Department of Justice is $36 billion, which is nearly 7% increase compared to fiscal year 2021, as enacted. This budget provides a renewed focus in critically important areas like the request for increased funding at the Civil Rights Division and Community Relations Service to provide for more attorneys and mediators. It also requests more funding and grant programs that will greatly assist our communities. I was particularly pleased personally to see nearly double the resources for the Office on Violence Against Women and appreciate the steady support for grant programs that address substance abuse. While I was pleased to see healthy increases nearly across the board for the department's agencies and programs, I did have some concerns, and I appreciated our conversation yesterday, Mr. Attorney General, and I shared some of these with you. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected everyone, but this has also been a dangerous time for those who have been locked at home with their abusers, away from their jobs, friends and family, schools, and other outside assistance like child services visits. Survivors experienced increased levels of violence, including increased threat of lethality. Agencies providing support to domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse victims had to quickly pivot to online or telephonic-only services as we halted in-person meetings. As pandemic restrictions are being lifted, it's expected that there will be even more of a demand for services like counseling and housing. And the Crime Victims Fund is often the primary source of federal funding for thousands of victim service providers across the nation, including programs serving victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, and human trafficking. But due to decreasing receipts in the fund, this funding stream, which provides critical services to survivors, is really in jeopardy. And while I appreciate the increases proposed in your budget request for discretionary grant programs, the $1 billion for the Office on Violence Against Women grants in particular, this budget also proposes a release of nearly $2.7 billion from the fund without recognizing the reality of the dramatic drop in receipts to the fund. I'm hoping to hear your thoughts on the department's rationale for the spending level and the plan for bolstering the fund in the future. This budget request proposes modest increases to the department's law enforcement components with one exception. Again, something we talked about, the Bureau of Prisons. I understand that there's a drop in the inmate population, but there's still a need for both specialized staffing like counselors and special education teachers to meet the needs of the First Step Act, as well as the unique medical needs of an aging prison population. The department also needs to keep safety in mind. This committee has continually requested that the Bureau of Prisons work toward curtailing the reliance of augmentation and overtime, and we need reassurance that this request will allow continued hiring of corrections officers. Senator Moran and I both have federal prisons in our states, and we hear very directly concerns from the corrections officers and employees there about staffing. In closing, I want to let the 115,000 career employees of the Department of Justice, including law enforcement personnel and attorneys, know how much their work to keep Americans safe from crime and terrorism is appreciated, especially during this last year through the COVID pandemic and here in the Capitol in response to the attack on January 6th. In particular, I appreciate the ongoing investigations by the FBI into this event and the peer counseling services that the Marshal Service provided for the Capitol Police. Mr. Attorney General, I look forward to your testimony and to the discussion today. I'm sure you will have a lot of interest from the members of this Subcommittee. And with that, I will turn it over to my ranking member, Senator Moran.
Thank you very much, Senator Shaheen. Thank you for convening this hearing. This continues our practice of having the Attorney General before our subcommittee, and I appreciate General Garland accepting our invitation. And I thank you for your outreach to me and my team since you became the General. Welcome to the CJS Subcommittee. I'm pleased to hear and discuss with you today the President's budget requests and the activities of the Department of Justice. Over the past few years, I've had the opportunity to meet many special agents, correctional officers, intelligence analysts, and attorneys that make up those 115,000 employees that Senator Shaheen referenced. I'm impressed by their professionalism, their integrity, their commitment to the Department's mission and to our nation. The Department of Justice is requesting $35.3 billion in fiscal year 2022. This is an increase of $1.9 billion, or a 5.6% increase above fiscal year 2021 enacted levels. The overwhelming bulk of this increase is dedicated to DOJ grant programs, while DOJ law enforcement agencies, the FBI, the DEA, the U.S. Marshal Service, and ATF will only receive a 2% increase overall. In a year in which the administration allowed agencies to request expansive budgets, the increase at the Drug Enforcement Agency is barely enough to cover inflation. The request will do nothing to reverse the 13% decline in the number of special agents since 2010. The DEA is on the front lines against sophisticated and ruthless drug traffickers and cartels, and the methamphetamine and opioid crisis continues to wreak havoc and terrible damage on communities in Kansas and across the country. I'm troubled by the lack of attention given to DEA in this budget request. Similarly, the Department requests an increase of only $40 million to bolster the FBI's cyber capabilities. This is less than 0.5% of the FBI's budget. As recently observed by Chris Curbs, formerly the government's top cybersecurity watchdog, we are in the midst of a ransomware pandemic, one that threatens our food supply and one that threatens our energy infrastructure. I question whether the Department is sufficiently investing in efforts to address these threats. Finally, I'm disturbed by the proposals to dramatically expand the Department's authority to regulate the ownership of firearms by law-abiding citizens. The administration has proposed repealing numerous provisions that were enacted in previous CJS bills that passed with overwhelming bipartisan votes. In the context of other recent actions by the White House and the ATF, it is difficult to see these proposals as anything but a broad assault on the Americans' Second Amendment's rights. Say that sentence more clearly. In the context of other recent actions by the White House and the ATF, it is difficult to see these proposals as anything but a broad assault on Americans' Second Amendment rights. With that said, there are many areas of this budget request in which I believe we find agreement. I'm pleased to see the Department has endorsed the new grant programs dedicated to improving police-community relations that Senator Shaheen and I worked together to create last year. These programs include support for de-escalation training on responding to individuals facing mental health crisis, and support for local agencies to secure accreditation. Attorney General Garland, I look forward to working with you and with Senator Shaheen and my colleagues on this subcommittee as we work to craft the fiscal year 2022 appropriations for the Department of Justice. And again, I thank you for your presence.
Thank you very much, Senator Moran. I will now turn it over to you, Mr. Attorney General, for your opening statement. And I don't think your mic is on.
Good? Okay. Good afternoon, Chairwoman Shaheen, Ranking Member Moran, and distinguished members of this subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you on behalf of the Department of Justice to discuss the President's budget for FY 2022. Exactly 90 days ago, I took the oath of office as Attorney General. On that day, I spoke to all the Justice Department employees, and I told them that all of us, quote, are united by our commitment to protecting our country, as our oath says, from all enemies, foreign and domestic, and by our commitment to enforcing our country's laws and to ensuring the civil rights and the civil liberties of our people. These commitments reflect the Justice Department's mission, and the Department's mission is reflected in our FY 2022 budget request. Our two top funding priorities are as follows. The first is keeping our country and our communities safe. This priority has three main elements. The first element is countering foreign and domestic terrorism. The Justice Department remains acutely aware of the threat posed by foreign terrorist organizations. This requires that we never take our eyes off the risk of another devastating attack on our country. At the same time, the United States has seen a troubling rise in domestic violent extremism. As the country's lead law enforcement agency, the Department of Justice is devoted to a broad-scale approach to countering the threat of both foreign and domestic terrorism. The FY 2022 budget request includes $9.4 billion. I skipped a page. Our budget request includes more than $1.5 billion for our foreign and domestic counterterrorism efforts, an increase of more than 12% above the FY 2021 enacted level. Keeping our country and communities safe also requires countering cyber threats from foreign and domestic actors, whether nation states, terrorists, or criminals, something that each of the two of you have already mentioned in your openings. The budget's request for $1.1 billion would be the largest increase in cyber resources for the Justice Department in more than a decade. Finally, keeping our country and communities safe requires protecting them from the recent increase in major violent crimes and gun violence. The Department's recently announced violent crime reduction strategy harnesses all our relevant departmental components to that end. The FY 2022 budget request includes $9.4 billion, an increase of nearly 9% to support the Justice Department's law enforcement resources and grant programs. This includes law enforcement efforts to fight violent crime and grants that fund community violence intervention programs, improve background checks, and red flag laws. The Department's other top priority is protecting civil rights and civil liberties. The President's FY 2022 budget requests more than $300 million for the Department's civil rights efforts. This includes the largest investment in a decade to reinvigorate the Justice Department's civil rights components and the largest ever increase in our Civil Rights Division, totaling more than 15%. Our request reflects the reality that almost 65 years after its creation, the division's work remains vital to protecting the American dream by safeguarding voting rights, prosecuting hate crimes, and addressing unlawful discrimination. This additional support for our civil rights work would also allow us to reestablish the Office for Access to Justice and would provide a much-needed lifeline for our Community Relations Service, which helps local communities mediate conflicts peacefully. The budget request also provides new funding for the Environment and Natural Resources Division to advance environmental justice and to tackle climate change. Promoting public trust between communities and law enforcement is critical both to making our communities safe and to ensuring the protection of civil rights. Our budget request for $1.3 billion, an increase of $379.8 million, would provide grants to support reforms necessary for promoting that trust. The FY 2022 budget also provides funding for other extraordinarily important grant programs. It proposes an investment of $1 billion to support Violence Against Women Act programs at DOJ, nearly twice the FY 2021 level. It proposes to almost double the programs that provide training and technical assistance for state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement in responding to hate and bias-motivated crimes. And we are also focused on reducing the immigration court backlog. A 21% budget increase to the Executive Office for Immigration Review will help us onboard 100 new immigration judges to reduce the nearly 1.3 million cases that were pending before the immigration courts when we took office. I ask for your support for our budget as the Justice Department continues its commitment to adhering to the rule of law, to keeping our country and communities safe, and to protecting civil rights and civil liberties. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will have 5-minute rounds for questions, and we will take senators in order of arrival. So I will begin, followed by the ranking member. As I said in my opening statement, Attorney General, I'm very concerned about what happens to the level of support in the Crime Victims Fund. Senator Leahy and I sent you a letter in March on this issue after your confirmation as Attorney General, and I know we're both, as is the committee, very interested in the steps that the department has taken to address the level of funding in the Crime Victims Fund and how you see that moving forward.
So I appreciate both the letter and the questions that you and I were able to discuss yesterday. I have a personal commitment to that fund. That's the fund that provided the money for Oklahoma City victims. So I know full well how important it is to everyone who's a victim of this kind of crime or of any crime. So I have looked into it, and I have been given to understand that given the receipts we expect to bring in this year and through FY22, at the end of 2022, we should have about a $400 million balance. That is, we do not expect the fund to run out, and we expect to have a balance. Now, I also agree with you, we ought to build up that fund further. So we're going to be looking in the Department of Justice into ways to do that. I understand there's some legislation pending, possibly adding additional crimes that would feed into the fund. And of course, we'll look into also other issues that you raised about taking certain kinds of pleas and taking certain kinds of delayed pleas that might have not resulted in restitution. The most important thing in these matters is for there to be sufficient restitution for the victims.
And as the result of the pandemic, have there been more requests for assistance from the fund over this last year? Do you know the answer to that?
I don't know the answer. All I do know is that we expect that the receipts that we have received already to be sufficient to provide the $400 million. But I don't know the answer. That's a very good question.
Perhaps you could find that out
Absolutely.
and share that with the committee. That would be interesting to know.
Absolutely. My staff will get back to yours.
Thank you. The other question we discussed in our phone conversation was the request for the Bureau of Prisons. And as you know, the practice known as augmentation is something that this committee has been concerned about for a while. It's certainly something I hear about from prison employees in New Hampshire. And so can you tell us what the department is doing to address and curtail augmentation?
Yes, I have to admit that was a word I had never heard of before I became Attorney General.
Yeah, me either.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. So I have looked at this, and I am, of course, concerned about this. It's protection of both the staff and the inmates require that we have the right number of staff in the Bureau of Prisons. So what I understand is that we are currently at 95% of authorized positions filled. So there will always be a percentage because of attrition, et cetera, but they have made dramatic increases in the number of hires to the point that BOP hired 900 net new staff, counting for attrition, since last May and since the previous May, and 281 net new hires in this past month alone. Now, it will likely always be the case that we won't get up to the full numbers, but the idea with augmentation is that people who switch into guard work or protective work have already been trained in that. We're not going to be sending people who are without the training. We also expect, of course, that with the number of inmates reduced, that we will have less of a problem of the kind that you described.
I certainly hope so. I know that vaccinations have been a concern with some of the employees and corrections officers in our prison in New Hampshire. Do you have any idea if that's been an issue in other prisons around the country?
Yes, so it certainly was an issue everywhere around the country, not only in prisons, but in the community as a whole. And I've looked into that as well. So with respect to inmates, 95% have been offered vaccines, Now, unfortunately, as with the community as a whole, not everyone accepts, but as of right now, at least 52% have received at least one vaccine dose. With respect to the Bureau of Prisons staff, 100% have been offered vaccines, 51% are fully vaccinated, and another 661 have received, in addition to that, have received their first vaccine dose. So we're in the right direction here. That there is the same problem that there is in the community at large, some resistance to this, which frankly I do not understand. I rushed out to get my vaccine as soon as it was available. But right now we have enough vaccines for everybody who is willing to take it.
And is there any consideration around trying to better engage with staff, and I assume inmates, but particularly staff, around why this is important and the difference that it could make for them?
Absolutely. Education on this issue, as with the CDC's general effort to educate the general population, is ongoing, and we don't want this to be a problem, obviously, for the protection of our staff and for our inmates, and so we're going to do everything we can to induce people, incentivize people to take the vaccines.
Thank you very much. Senator Moran.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. General, shortly after the President's inauguration, the President issued an executive order on the renewal of DOJ contracts with privately operated criminal detention facilities. I believe that applying this executive order to the U.S. Marshals Service is a serious mistake. Unlike the Bureau of Prisons, which I assume the administration really was directing their attention to, I'm not sure of that, of course, the Marshals don't own any of their own facilities. They exclusively contract with the Bureau of Prisons, state and local prisons, and jails and private facilities. Closing private facilities will inevitably require federal prisoners to be housed at facilities further from courthouses at which their cases are being considered. There are ethical and constitutional concerns with moving prisoners potentially far distances from their families and legal counsel. However, we are now also learning that this policy will cost hundreds of millions of dollars for U.S. taxpayers. The Department's budget request estimates that implementation of the executive order will cost the U.S. Marshals Service $75 million in additional transportation housing costs, and that is just for fiscal year 2020. So my question, General, is, has the Department consulted with the White House about those costs and what I think is unintended consequences of applying the executive order to the U.S. Marshals Service?
Well, thank you for your question. There is a principle involved here, leaving aside the specifics of the issue you're raising about the marshals. The administration's policy, and I believe to be the correct policy, is that prison is government work. It is a government function, and it contravenes sometimes the due process clause to be keeping people in privately owned areas which are not responsive to all of the requirements of federal law and which are not as easy for us to supervise as they would be if they were federal employees. Now, that said, you put your finger on the correct distinction, which is it's relatively easy for us to have done this with respect to the Bureau of Prisons because there was already Bureau of Prisons space. With respect to marshals, as you point out, this was contracted space. So we have a plan of phasing the marshals part of this in over a somewhat longer period. The money is to move them from private space to state or local government space so that we still are satisfying our concern that this be a government function. You're right about the amount, but this is the amount necessary to transfer the people from one to the other. I don't think this will be a problem in the longer run. I also completely agree with you that it's important to have particularly detention areas near where somebody lives. It's important from the point of view of family connections and continuing connections to the community. And it's also important from the point of view of having appropriate legal representation and lawyers, defense lawyers, not having to travel so far that they're unable to do that. So your concerns are my concerns.
I appreciate hearing that, and I would ask if you could share with me the outline of the plan for moving forward in regard to the marshals.
All right. My staff will get back to yours. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. The tragic death of Judge Esther Salas last July impressed on me and others the extraordinary threats that our federal judges face. Last year, I worked to provide additional funding to the U.S. Marshal Service for judicial security operations. The department's budget this year, for fiscal year 2022, includes a program increase of $33.4 million to further enhance Marshal judicial security programs. I would expect you to be very knowledgeable of the circumstances that judges face in regard to their security, and I expect you to have a well-informed perspective on this. General Garland, what can you tell us, the committee, about the proposed program increases and the need for additional investment in federal judge security?
Well, you have pointed your finger at the right person. I was on the Judicial Security Committee for many years when I was a judge, and I was also chair of the Executive Committee, which oversees the other committees, including the Security Committee. So I've delved very deeply into this problem with respect to judicial security, and it is a big problem and is a dangerous problem. And as we have a rise in domestic violent extremism, it is a serious threat. This amount of money, we believe, will enable us to upgrade the home security systems and to provide marshals intelligence for better tracking threats against judges. And you can be assured I take this one also quite personally.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for recognizing the importance of security. From my perspective, it's certainly security for the judges and their families, but it's also a threat against our system of government. Judges need to be safe and secure, and the threats need to be addressed seriously, both protection and ultimate prosecution of perpetrators.
This is exactly right. You can't have a democracy with due process of law if judges are afraid to make the decisions they do.
I almost said democracy, General, but every time I start to say democracy, I remember a republic, and it confuses me as to how I'm supposed to phrase these questions. So thank you for saying that we live in a democracy.
A republic is a representative democracy. I think that's what Hamilton meant.
Thank you for the clarification. My time has expired. I would indicate to you, both to the chairman and to you, General, that I also am the ranking member of the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs. It's meeting this afternoon. You'll see me here intermittently. It's not by lack of interest in what you have to say.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Moran. I should have announced at the beginning that the witness has requested a brief recess about 3:15, so we will take a short recess at 3:15 at his request. And when I said we were going to take people in order of arrival, I lied. I'm actually going to take the chairman of the committee next, Senator Leahy, as is our custom. Senator.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. And as you recall, I did the same thing before as chairman, but with others. It's good to see you, Attorney General. And I agree, Senator Moran, that we want to have security for our courts and judicial personnel, just as I hope that we will finally get all the answers of what happened on January 6th, so we'll have security of our really the symbol of our democracy, the U.S. Capitol, the thousands of people who work here, the men and women, tourists, and everybody else. And I hope that we'll finally get the answers to everything behind that. Now, Attorney General, in the past few weeks, your department has endorsed some highly controversial positions taken by the former President's Justice Department. Many have expressed concerns about that. For example, the Trump DOJ removed from the state court to federal court a defamation charge involving an assault allegation against Donald Trump by a woman. The release of the OLC memo on obstruction of justice conclusions and so on. How is this coming about? Are these criticisms valid, or what do you say about them?
Senator, I'm grateful for you asking me the question, and I know about the criticisms. Look, the job of the Justice Department in making decisions of law is not to back any administration, previous or present. Our job is to represent the American people. And our job in doing so is to ensure adherence to the rule of law, which is the fundamental requirement of a democracy or a republic or a representative democracy. And the essence of the rule of law is what I said when I accepted the nomination for Attorney General. It is that like cases be treated alike, that there not be one rule for Democrats and another for Republicans, that there not be one rule for friends and another for foes. Now, it is not always easy to apply that rule. Sometimes it means that we have to make a decision about the law that we would never have made and that we strongly disagree with as a matter of policy. But in every case, the job of the Justice Department is to make the best judgment it can as to what the law requires. Now, matters of policy, of course, are completely different, and that explains why we have reversed the policies of the previous administration many times over the last 3 months, and why we have initiated our own policies that are distinctly different from those of the previous administration. But this is an important issue, the distinction between law and policy, and it's at the center of ensuring adherence to the rule of law, for which the Justice Department stands.
Well, as you know, and you and I have had discussions on other matters, I think I've been first to say that there may be areas we agree or disagree with you, but follow the law, and which is basically what I've said to every Attorney General from Republican or Democratic administration since I was here. I'm worried about another area. Our right to vote is under assault in dozens of states. I can't believe some of the, you think you're back in the old Jim Crow era to see some of the bills that come up. I'm trying to find a path to reintroduce and enact the bipartisan John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. I want to restore the Department's pre-clearance powers, but that could take time. In the meantime, you now have Kristen Clark, the helm of the Civil Rights Division. What's the Justice Department doing today to combat voter suppression schemes across the country? Well, as I said, with respect to our budget request, we're asking for a considerable expansion in the number of, in the amount of money for the Civil Rights Division, and which will allow us to hire more attorneys. But on the specific question, we are reviewing, as you would expect, allegations that come in with respect to voting. Voting is a fundamental element of our democracy. In fact, without it, without the right to vote, none of the other rights follow. And it was the founding purpose of the Justice Department during Reconstruction to ensure the right to vote of newly freed African Americans who were under militant attack to prevent them from voting. And the Voting Rights Act in the 60s reaffirmed that concern, and that is very much present on our mind now. Thank you. And I think you could expect that Senator Shaheen and I will continue on the Crime Victims Fund to work with you. You should also feel free if things come up and they do not appear that the funds are coming the way you thought, let the two of us know. We will. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Attorney General, for being with us today. I'm the ranking member on the Senate Appropriations Committee for Homeland Security, and I've followed closely CISA's work to respond to and mitigate cyber breaches and the ransomware attacks. FBI Director Wray recently compared current ransomware threat to the threats of 9/11, And there is some debate from both Congress and the White House as to whether or not to ban outright, to ban private companies from paying ransom when they become victims of cyber attacks. As you know, this is an issue that we not just face here in the United States, but globally. So I asked the same question yesterday, wondering from the Secretary of State, and I'd like to hear your perspective. Are you working with our allies diplomatically to try, you know, in your, as Chief Law Enforcement Officer, in other countries to try to figure out how we, A, stop this, B, prevent it from happening again, and where you see this going in the next near future?
I'll start with the bottom question, which is not a happy answer,
Yeah.
Which is this is getting worse and worse, and we have to do everything we possibly can here. This is a very, very serious threat. You know, we saw what can happen with respect to a pipeline, with respect to a food processing company. You can imagine what could happen if we had multiple attacks at the same time on even more fundamental infrastructure. So I'm very worried about it, and so is the administration, and that's why we've asked for such a large increase in our cyber budget. That's also why the administration has stood up a full process on this question in the National Security Council, and that's why the Justice Department has stood up its own cybersecurity task force, and particularly focusing on ransomware. And as you acknowledge, we've already had one pretty significant success. One significant success is not really going to be enough. This has to be a constant, you know, just a constant focus. And in each future year, it's going to require more money. We think we have the right amount of money now, but fair warning, we're going to be coming back for more money after this. On the other question, specific question you asked about diplomatic, yes. So one advantage of a sad situation of the pandemic is that I'm able to meet with attorneys general and home secretaries without having to travel to many different countries. And in my first few weeks, that is what I did, and I met with our four closest allies, and I also met with the EU, each of the EU members, and I also communicated by telephone separately with a number of our allies on this question, among others. So this is top of mind, I assure you.
Well, we certainly want to be extremely supportive of you and your efforts, of Homeland Security as well, and the Department of State, because I think what you've told us is what we all feel, that we are very, very concerned about this. I'm going to switch topics here. Since the passage of the Fix NICS Act, which I was a proud co-sponsor of, we've seen continuous increases in the number of background checks run through the NICS system. In fact, this year we've seen record-breaking numbers of checks run, with some months reaching over 4 million. Those background checks are done in Senator Manchin, our home state of West Virginia. We're very proud of the effort that we're doing there and the way we're contributing. What steps will your department take to support the NICS system and ensure that we are enforcing background check laws that are already on the books? And what are the funding needs to? From time to time, we've really upped the funding here. Is that I looked through your thing to see if there was something about that in your budget request, and I would invite you to visit the facility in West Virginia. It's quite something to see.
Just trying to get the number for the NICS system. First of all, you're absolutely right. This is essential to the fight against violent crime and against gun violence. We have to keep guns away from people who are legally not permitted to have guns, which is the purpose of this system. And also, of course, it helps us to, when a bad event occurs, to find if somebody has violated the law in obtaining a gun. So included in the anti-gun violence programs are state and local grants of $421 million, including NICS, which is an increase in 62%. Wow. So your concern about this is the same as our concern. We couldn't be more in line.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Senator Manchin, we're going to do West Virginia all at the same time here.
All the way. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Attorney General, for your service. Intelligence reports prior to January 6th riot warned Capitol Police that supporters of President Trump were actively promoting violence and targeting Congress itself. The Department of Homeland Security specifically notified Capitol Police that they had identified a map of the Capitol's tunnel system and online messages between Stop the Steal supporters and the FBI field office in Norfolk, also warned the Capitol Police. But however, the Capitol Police Inspector General also found a lack of consensus among key officials about whether these reports indicated specific known threats. As you both know, it's impossible to prepare to respond unless without much reliable information as possible. So my question would be, in your position so far, do you feel both your departments have been sufficiently receiving and relaying threat information with each of the other federal departments? We seem to have a disconnect, and sometimes that's very costly, as we've seen. And then a follow-up would be, how do we increase the coordination within the federal government to respond more quickly?
Well, I can imagine, since I think I was nominated on January 7th, that January 6th is very sharply engraved on my mind. I think the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, which are the two principal departments for this purpose, are very well lashed up now. We have joint task forces along this whole area, and the National Security Council has engaged both of us in the involvement in the assessment of the domestic violent extremist threat. So there will always be problems, but I'm reasonably confident that we won't have a problem like that again. Now, with respect to the Capitol Police and our relationship with them, to be honest, I don't know enough to know about that. This has certainly raised that issue, and I will go back again and speak with the FBI director on exactly how that's been done. But I think there's no excuse at this point for that kind of clear connection not to be made.
Do you know how many people have been arrested to date?
Do I know how many?
Do you all have a figure on that?
Like off the top of my head, within some margin of error, it's about 456, something like that.
And how do you
There will be many. There will be more. I was about to say many, and I don't want to say that. We have a very good method of finding the additional people who are inside the Capitol, and I would call it crowdsourcing, thanks to the omnipresent videos that everybody took, and even private citizens have posted.
How many prosecutions have we had so far?
We've charged 400.
Charged 400. Okay. Has anyone been sentenced?
I don't think anybody's been sentenced. I think there's been one or two pleas so far, and the other ones are all pending. Yeah.
On March 29, 2020, Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or the CARES Act, was signed into law, provided $2 trillion economic relief to help Americans cope with the economic impact. Among other things, the CARES Act originally authorized up to $349 billion in forgivable loans to small businesses for job retention, certain other expenses through PPP Payroll Protection Program. While the PPP loans helped millions of struggling businesses stay afloat during the pandemic, it also provided a unique opportunity for creative fraudsters to take advantage of federal government's generous terms. So I would go down quickly to say, I think you know where I'm going with this, and if you can explain to me how we are doing on that, because I've some of the numbers I have seen has been unbelievable. $250 million in taxpayer subsidized loans, funds give to potentially ineligible recipients. Then we had, according to the report, there were 1.9 million in pending SBA transactions made to accounts outside the United States. Another 3,000 suspicious transactions worth $73 million that were flagged by financial institutions. Can you give me an update of where we are on that?
Yes. So this is a circumstance that I saw even coming in, even before the reports. It seemed obvious that my last go-around in the Justice Department had to do with healthcare fraud being one of the top issues. And we stood up a task force which was very good at integrating information from all the relevant inspectors general and from the agencies, together with our law enforcement and our prosecutors. At that time, we didn't have big data to make these evaluations. Now we do. And so we have stood up and I've issued a memorandum on standing up a COVID fraud task force, which has been stood up. It involves all of the relevant inspector generals from the different agencies cooperating with each other. It involves all of our relevant law enforcement agencies on both the federal side, components on both the federal side and the civil side, and our U.S. Attorney's offices. And in our request, there's a $41.3 million request for new funding for the U.S. Attorney's Office, for the Criminal Division, and for the Civil Division specifically for COVID fraud. So I would say, maybe this is a bad metaphor, but this is a target-rich environment.
Yeah.
There is a lot of that fraud that happened in the past that we're going to go after. You've already probably seen our reports of major takedowns with respect, and we're hoping that this will be a deterrent to future fraud.
The money that, let me just finish up real quick, the money that you all receive or be able to retract back for the United States, does that go to the Treasury or does it go back into circulation so we can get it to the people that need it the most?
That's my question is, I guess, following up with Senator Shaheen's question, does that go really into the Crime Victims Fund? Might be a good way to ask that question. Do we know the answer?
Can you maybe? That's okay. If you don't have it,
we'll look into that. But
please do.
But the bottom line is, before it even goes into that fund, the first thing is restitution, and restitution to the specific companies or individuals who were defrauded if it's a private fraud.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. And Mr. Attorney General, we're having a little trouble hearing you. Maybe you could pull the mic closer.
Closer?
You have
better?
to really speak directly into the mic.
I'm sorry. You want me to start all over?
Maybe not. All right. Thank you, Senator Collins.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Attorney General. The website ProPublica has indicated that it has, quote, obtained a vast trove of IRS data on the tax returns of thousands of the nation's wealthiest people. The publication is not disclosing how it obtained the data. So we don't know whether the source for these materials was outside of the federal government or within the federal government. But we can be certain of one thing. These highly confidential personal documents were obtained illegally. Any taxpayer should be guaranteed that their privacy will be protected when they provide information and file their returns with the IRS. As we saw during Watergate, there is an incredible danger to private citizens and the credibility of the federal government if information is used for political or other purposes. Anything short of the highest degree of privacy protection for taxpayers' information could cause them to be far less willing to provide the information that is required by the IRS for full compliance. Does the Department of Justice have any information about the origin of this breach, and what steps is the department taking to investigate, identify, and apprehend those responsible?
Senator, I take this as seriously as you do. I very well remember what President Nixon did in the Watergate period, the creation of enemies lists and the punishment of people through reviewing their tax returns. This is an extremely serious matter. People are entitled, obviously, to the greatest privacy with respect to their tax returns. To be honest, I know nothing more about this than what I read in the ProPublica piece, which I also read and was astonished. Now, what I did read in that piece was that the director of the IRS is on it, and he said that their inspectors were working on it, and I'm sure that that means it will be referred to the Justice Department. And when this was on my list of things to raise after I finished preparing for this hearing, and I promise you it will be at the top of my list.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. The second issue that I want to raise with you are reports that I am hearing from police departments all over the country that they're having great difficulties in retaining and recruiting police officers. And in every single case where I've talked to police officers and police chiefs, they say that it's due to the fact that there's been this vilification of law enforcement rather than trying to strengthen and improve practices of police departments, and that the ill-conceived defund the police movement has also led to significant problems. And this isn't just in our largest cities. We're seeing difficulties with recruitment and retention in rural Maine. For example, Van Buren, Maine, a small community in northern Maine, has completely disbanded its police department because it can't hire officers. The town of Fort Kent, Maine, which has about 4,000 people and last year responded to 5,000 different calls, can't get enough officers and is considering disbanding its department as well. And at the same time, in large cities, not fortunately in Maine, we're seeing an increase in crime, a substantial increase. Do you personally believe that efforts to vilify rather than improve our police departments, including the defund the police movement, have contributed to these recruitment and retention problems?
Senator, no one could look at the Justice Department budget that we put in front of you and think that the Justice Department supports defunding the police. We've asked for, with respect to our grant programs, $651 million for the COPS program, which is a $265 million increase. This includes $537 million specifically for COPS hiring, which is a $300 million increase. Likewise, for the Burn JAG grants, we've asked for $513.5 million, which is a $29.5 million increase. So, no, as President Biden has made absolutely clear, we are not asking to defund the police. Now, a lot of what we are doing, in addition to supporting hiring, is trying to support trust building between communities and police departments. Not to vilify anyone, but as I said in previous testimony, for police to do their work well and safely, they need to have the trust of the community. And the community needs to have trust in the police department that their civil rights will be protected. This includes accountability for police officers who violate constitutional rights, but it does not have anything to do with vilifying whole departments or anything like that. The Justice Department has responsibility under the statutes provided by Congress to pursue investigations where we believe constitutional rights have been violated, and we have announced, I think, 2 of those. And we also have responsibility to do pattern or practice investigations to determine whether there are police departments that have a pattern or practice of unconstitutional behavior. But that is a completely different question than where we are that you're asking about. And I want to be clear that these are 2. You can hold both of these in your hands at the same time and not be inconsistent with each other.
But let me be very clear. I was not suggesting
I know you weren't.
that the administration or the president or you were part of this effort. But the fact is it exists. And I know your efforts are to improve policing, and I'm a strong supporter of the COPS program. In fact, I worked on it with the president years ago and the Burn Justice Department grants. But I was trying to get your personal opinion on whether this effort, which you're not a part of, is contributing to the recruitment and the retention problems that are being experienced all over the country.
Yeah, I have to say, to answer that question requires data that I just don't have. It requires all kinds of survey data, and I, you know, anecdotally, I've heard some things like you're saying, but I really don't have any data that I can confidently give you an answer to.
Thank you, Senator Collins. Before we go to Senator Reed, Senator Moran would like to make a correction for the record.
Thank you, Chairman. I think in my question to to the Attorney General, I indicated the death of Judge Esther Salas rather than the death of her son.
Yeah.
And if I did that, I want to make clear that I would like the record to reflect the tragedy that has occurred and have that stated in the factual basis.
Thank you very much, Senator. We will make sure that that correction is made. Senator Reid.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Attorney General, for not only being here but for your service. Recently, we've observed an alarming increase of incidents on commercial aircraft regulated by the FAA. In fact, 2,500 reports this year, about 20 times the average number. Some of them involving very violent attacks on flight attendants, and also indications that TSA agents are also being subject to abuse, to insult, and to worse. Can you discuss what DOJ's involvement may be in these cases? Are you prioritizing what incidents should be taken directly into the federal attorney for prosecution, or are you allowing some to remain with the FAA?
So this is a good question as to which I don't know a complete answer. So assaults on these, I've read the same about the assaults on these planes. They are extraordinarily dangerous, even if not intended to bring the plane down. You can imagine the kind of pandemonium on planes that we've seen in some of these videos that people have taken that can cause an incredibly dangerous accident. So we take them extremely seriously. The states have authority over these matters. To be honest, I'm not sure whether it's the state they fly over or the state they land on. This is a conflicts of law question, which I think I may have skipped that course in law school, but there is clearly a state authority here, and I think most of these cases end up that way. But it is also a federal crime to commit an assault like that on interstate commerce of the kind that we're talking about. I will go back and look more carefully to see whether TSA or FAA has referred what they've referred us to here. But these strike me not as things for the FAA. These are not administrative matters. These are criminal matters.
Thank you. You indicated quite accurately that our major threats are domestic violent extremists, homegrown violent extremists, and international extremists. And they're all using to coordinate social media, encrypted transmissions. What tools and authorities or resources do you need to combat these terrorist groups and their use of social media and other forms of encrypted coordination?
Well, this is also a very hard question. You're very good at asking me very hard questions. The problem is severe because people talking on social media can incite people up to radicalization. This is what we fear, and we've seen this in the foreign terrorist circumstance where people are watching jihadist websites that eventually move them, and much more swiftly than ever before, from mere involvement and interest to radicalization to action. We expect that the same is likely to occur with respect to domestic violent extremism, although likely different websites, but maybe not even. This is a matter of serious concern. So where there is a threat of violence, where we have predication, a reasonable articulation, the Bureau can go in and look at what's happening and find out what it can find out. And of course, as this escalates, the Bureau has other mechanisms of doing the same. The reason I say it's a hard question is one I'm sure you know. It's the First Amendment. Yes. And the question is, what do we do earlier stages of this, where there isn't yet violence, there's the kind of talk that maybe could lead to it, and this is a very hard problem. And I know that the Judiciary Committee and this committee have asked us to think about what more tools we might need, and we are thinking about that. And certainly our experience on the January 6th investigation will help us make those decisions. But at every case, we have to worry about the First Amendment issue on the other side, and not making it difficult for people to say things, even hateful things, because even that kind of speech is protected.
Just as a suggestion, you don't have to comment, is there might be an opportunity for an information literacy commission that could design programs where people become more aware of the disinformation rather than what they believe is true information, and that could be an effective way to counter some of these problems. But thank you very much, General.
Thank you. I appreciate the suggestion.
Thank you, Senator Reed. Senator Bozeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for being here. We do appreciate your work.
Thank you.
I'm like Senator Moran. I've got to run in a second and go to Veterans Affairs, but I did want to follow up on Senator Collins' question in regard to, the seriousness of the breach of the IRS, and we've had other breaches there in the past. It could have been somebody there. It could have been a hack. We don't know what's happened at all. They're talking about significantly lowering the threshold, the reporting threshold, $10,000, significantly lower than that. Based on the fact that we have had problems in the past regarding hacking, other issues, and then two, the pipeline issue, the packing plant issue, does it seem like a good idea to centralize that much information in an agency? Right now it's spread out. If you have an interest or the IRS has an interest, they can contact the local bank. But to pour through so much data and then be responsible for that data and be able to secure that is a huge job for the federal government, and one that we don't do a very good job of. So could you comment on that?
Yes. Just particularly on, to respond on the suspicious transaction reports, I believe, and I'll come back if I'm wrong about this, I think we have a recent prosecution of somebody who leaked the information with respect to that matter. So it gives you an idea of how seriously we take this. Now, on the bigger question, look, this is the conundrum that the digital age has brought us to. We can distribute information and keep it on paper, and that's the perfect solution to hacking if there's never a connection to the internet. But it also means we can't use the information in a way that's useful for tracking terrorist behavior, for tracking child exploitation, for tracking espionage, for tracking bribery. And that's why we have the special transaction reports, so that it makes it easier for us, maybe even possible for us to do that. And I know that, I think I saw that the Treasury Department is suggesting something like that for cryptocurrency, which may also be essential as an ability to continue this, particularly since we saw with the ransomware circumstance, that's the way in which it's being paid. So, my view would be we need to strengthen our cyber security, maybe keep systems separate, but the idea of distributing them in a way that we can't access them in some central way means it would be very difficult for us to make it the kind of use that you want us, to put to this very important information. So the committee here is filled with hard questions. This is a really hard question, and it puts two different principles which are dear to us in conflict sometimes.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Bozeman. Senator Feinstein.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I am very interested in hate crimes, and there has been a very sharp increase in violence committed against Asian Americans since the pandemic began. One database included over 2,800 reports of anti-Asian discrimination in the last 9 months of 2020. And the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino, found that Asian hate crimes increased by approximately 150% last year. So the question is, what is the department doing to address these hate crimes against Asian Americans? And how can we help support your efforts?
Well, I appreciate the question. One of the very first acts I took after becoming Attorney General, after becoming Attorney General, was to ask for direct a 30-day review of this problem with respect to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and that report has come back to me, and we have announced the establishment of a hate crime task force. As that report was coming back, the Congress passed the Hate Crimes Act, the two Hate Crimes Act, which were combined, which had a number of requests for the department to do. We have accomplished all of the things that Congress asked us to do, and we put out an announcement. We have established a hate crimes coordinator in the Associate Attorney General's office. There'll be a Deputy Associate Attorney General, whose job will be to coordinate civil and criminal side law enforcement in this area, because most of the hate crime law enforcement comes from the Civil Rights Division, which is on our under the supervision of the Associate Attorney General. We have established in the Civil Rights Division the chief of the criminal civil rights section as the I would say expediter is the best word. This was a requirement of the Hate Crimes Act to make sure that the U.S. Attorney's offices are, and the department as a whole are expediting our response to hate crimes. We have established a language service in the department, because this is obviously a very important part of that. And we have in this particular, in this request for hate crimes response trading grants at $9 million, which is an increase of $4 million over FY22. So we take this very seriously, and you are absolutely right.
Good.
There is a serious increase in hate crimes across the board.
Good. As you probably know, the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremists at California State University, San Bernardino, found that Asian hate crimes have increased by 150% in this country. And I believe we can't tolerate this, so whatever we can do to be helpful to you, I would be most happy to participate in. Let me move to the next question. Justice introduced model legislation for extreme risk laws. The model is very similar to legislation that I've introduced, which is called the Extreme Risk Protection Order Act, which would give grants to states to help them create and implement extreme risk laws. I think these are really important tools that empower family members and law enforcement to ask courts to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people found to be dangerous. We have 19 states and the District of Columbia that have extreme risk laws now on the books. Can you explain why the department, I agree with this, believes extreme risk laws can help reduce gun violence? And what would you tell us today about the need to pass legislation on this issue?
Right. So this actually, we just did this. What you're referring to, I think, was just maybe 2 days ago or 3 days ago. I signed a memorandum in connection with the other rulemaking with respect to stabilizing arm braces at the beginning of this week. These are model extreme risk laws the states can adopt. We have in this budget $40 million of grants, which can be used by states for this purpose. The idea is, as you eloquently put it, is to make sure that people who are in extreme risk, either to themselves or to their loved ones, have the guns taken away temporarily while the matter is adjudicated. And if a judge concludes that it is a risk to keep the gun away for some specific amount of time specified in the state statutes. There are, as we sadly know, gun deaths that can occur when people in extremists, mental issues for themselves or personal crises, put the gun on themselves or put the gun on somebody else. And we want to alleviate that cause of a terrible tragedy by both protecting the gun owners' due process rights, but protecting the potential community victims from the risk of death.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very concerned about this. I come from a big state, and it's many different people. I've seen a database included over 2,800 reports of anti-Asian discrimination in the last 9 months of 2020. So I would hope that your Department of Justice would be particularly sensitive right now about anti-Asian hate crimes, because I think the increase of 150% has been quite dramatic.
I quite agree with you, and that's why I've spoken to a number of Pacific Islanders and Asian American groups already.
Good. And if there's anything we can do to be helpful, my time's up.
Yes, thank you very much, Senator Feinstein. We will take Senator Coons, then we'll take a brief break because we think we have a couple of members on their way back. Senator Coons.
Great. Thank you, Chairwoman Shaheen. Thank you, Attorney General Garland, for joining us again and for your regular engagement with the Senate. In Delaware, the Newcastle County Police Department and the Christiana Care Health System have jointly stood up a behavioral health unit that pairs mental health professionals with local law enforcement to respond to individuals going through a mental health crisis. And I've heard from elected officials, community advocates, and law enforcement leaders across the country they would welcome these kind of co-responder models that allow for a more appropriately trained and equipped response to individuals going through mental health crisis. Can you speak to the value of these models, the impact they have in benefiting communities and improving police-community relations, and what sorts of investments you see making in providing better access to these kinds of models going forward?
You're exactly right. Sometimes we have crises that arise because the wrong people are responding. Police officers often are not equipped in terms of their experience and even their equipment to deal with a person who's having a problem. It's really not a criminal or violence problem, but a question of instability. And these can get out of hand, and police officers would like to have the assistance of mental health professionals in the co-responder circumstance that you're talking about. And this is better for the community and, in the end, for the person in crisis. So we couldn't agree more. Our funding includes a request for grants, $40 million, which is a $5 million increase for mental health collaborations, and $10 million, which is a $2.5 million increase for training to improve police-based responses to people with mental illness.
Do you think that's a sufficient investment given the scope of the need? Has there been a thorough assessment of how many different communities and how many different public health serving agencies and law enforcement agencies might benefit from this kind of model?
Okay, so I think this, like many others of these kind of innovative interventions, are works in progress, and we have to evaluate them to see how they work. We want an evidence-based approach that does work, and so this is, I think, a sufficient amount for us to get seriously involved in this, and then next year maybe I'll come back and ask for more money.
My hometown of Wilmington, Delaware, and many other cities, both large and small across the country, has seen a significant rise in violent crime in recent years. I note the proposal of $100 million for a new community violence intervention initiative. We have a group violence intervention program to try and interrupt violence before it accelerates in Wilmington. I'm wondering if you can describe in any more detail how you intend to implement this program and what sort of coordination it might include with other federal agencies.
Yeah, so this is a new program, and it has several possible approaches. I think that the Office of Justice Programs will have to figure out exactly what the best way, what kind of incentives to give, and what kind of programs to give grants to. It's everything from proven violence interrupters, people who have been out on the street trying to get gangs to conciliate, to put down their guns, to hospital-based intervention, where the interrupters go to visit somebody who's been shot and is in a hospital and try to conciliate and persuade them not to take vengeance and persuade their relatives not to take vengeance. So there are a series of these different methods of interruption, and many have been very successful. You know, as with all of our programs, we're going to try and give grants to those that have been shown successful, and then to use those as examples to hold out for others to fulfill, and when they meet those requirements, to get the grants as well.
Thank you. I look forward to following up with you and with the Office of Justice Programs around these initiatives, as well as initiatives to expand access to body-worn cameras in state and local law enforcement. I was encouraged to see the announcement you'd mandate federal law enforcement to wear body-worn cameras. Right. I was encouraged to see a significant increase in the request for the Victims of Child Abuse Act programming and a new task force to combat trafficking and corruption in the Northern Triangle in Mexico, and look forward to working with you on all these different aspects of your budget proposal. Thank you.
We appreciate it, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Coons. As I announced, we will have a 10-minute break, but if I could just ask, Senator Murkowski has requested a clarification on an earlier question before we break because she's not able to stay. So, Senator Murkowski.
Madam Chairman, thank you. And Mr. Attorney General, thank you for the work that you are doing and your responses today. When Senator Shaheen had led her questioning with regards to the VOCA funds and a concern that we are seeing additional demand on those funds, certainly in Alaska we are, the increase to calls to the sexual assault hotlines have increased by 52% since the beginning of the pandemic. Shelters are experiencing overwhelming amounts of strain, and the 30-some-odd organizations that we have in our state are facing this 35% cut to their VOCA funds, which is absolutely frightening everybody. But as we look at the President's budget with a $2.65 billion cap for the funds, in FY19, Congress put the VOCA cap at $3.5 billion. We understand the structural issues relating to the deposit fund. We're trying to address this through legislation. That's absolutely what has to happen. But in any case, what we have is this decreasing cap is going to impact the effect on the ground for victim services. If not for this year, then absolutely for next year. So you have said to the chairman that there was a $400 million surplus that you anticipate at the end of the year. The way I understand
at the end of 22.
At the end of 22.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Yes.
Yeah.
At the end of 22. But if I understand what we have coming into the fund versus the outlays, that will result in decreases. If again, not necessarily this year, next year, the next fiscal year. So I just want to make sure that we're not operating under the assumption that, in fact, we're going to be okay in this next fiscal year, because right now I think all the victim services in my state, and I think Senator Shaheen in yours, are just desperately afraid of these cuts that are coming. And so I want to understand whether or not we are, whether there is any flexibility with additional funding that could be used to supplement so we don't have this hit again at a really difficult time for so many that are providing these important and vital services to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and the like.
I completely agree that the bigger this fund, the better, because there's, in many ways, an unending demand, and appropriately so. Just to clarify what I said about the money, as of April, we've collected sufficient receipts to cover all the way through FY22, FY21, and 22. We expect to end this fiscal year with $3 billion, which will cover the $2.6 billion request. That's where my $400 million net at the end of that time comes from. Obviously, we would like to have a higher amount at the end, but the way we are now, that would require taking less money out of the fund, which is the opposite of what you want.
Right, that's not where we want to go.
Right,
yeah.
right. So I think I'm not an expert budgeteer, but it seems to me that what we need is to be able to put more money into this fund, which means expanding the kind of crimes that flow into it, but also, that prosecutors in the Justice Department need to take more attention to getting restitution that goes into this fund, and not to be satisfied with other kinds of, pleas, for example. So it's hard to say that as an across-the-board question, but that's the best I can do at this point.
Well, I think we're all trying to get to the same place, which is we don't want to see these significant cuts to our victims' services. Right. We've got to address legislatively, I think, the construct of the VOCA funds. Will work on that. But
let me ask my team to work with you on.
I would
appreciate
both of you
that.
Thank you.
I think this is very important.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention, and thank you for letting me jump in before the break.
Thank you, Senator Murkowski. As we promised the witness, we'll now take a 10-minute break.
Thank you.
I will now call the CJS hearing back to order and call on Senator Graham.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you.
Welcome, Mr. Attorney General. I think Senator Coons was mentioning some ideas about having some resources outside of traditional policing to deal with mental health issues. Didn't y'all have a discussion about that, I think?
We did.
Count me in. I'd like to help in that regard.
Thank you.
So last year, the Senate Judiciary Committee, I was the chairman, reported a bill out of the committee 13-9 that waived sovereign immunity, allowing Americans to sue China in federal court. You have to prove causation and all the normal rules have to be followed for damage done by the coronavirus. Do you support that idea?
I have to say I'm not familiar with the bill. I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm going to send it to you.
Okay.
I would urge you to get back with me sooner rather than later. Because do you agree with me if, in fact, this was a lab leak, the source of the virus came out of a Chinese lab because of negligence, China should pay somebody?
I really don't. I don't know enough about this to know. I know that, that the government is beginning to evaluate that, reevaluate that.
I'm just giving you a hypothetical. If the Chinese government lied about the origins of the coronavirus, and it in fact came from a lab leak in Wuhan, which they denied, do you agree that they should be held accountable and compensate the world in some fashion for the damage they've done?
I think this is a diplomatic issue and an issue for the State Department and the executive branch.
You don't see legal?
I think the way you put it, which you asked whether they should compensate the world in some manner, I think that
okay,
it doesn't fit in my.
That can be diplomatic, but what, like we allowed victims of 9/11 to sue Saudi Arabia and other countries.
Yes.
For their part, any part they may have played in 9/11.
Yeah.
Do you think that model should be allowed for China?
Again, I think this is a policy question for the diplomats. I'm just a poor lawyer.
Okay. All right. So do you believe there's a crime wave in the United States regarding violent crime?
I think there's a serious, significant rise in major violent crime beginning last year. Yes, I do.
Thank you. That shortened up these questions. You're dead right. Atlanta's 59% increase in homicide. Chicago 56. Houston 42. Portland 800%. L.A. County 127%. Atlanta 63%. The numbers are pretty staggering. What do you think has caused that?
I know better, having lived through several crime waves, as both of us have, and both of us know that figuring out exactly what's caused particularly
is it
a
possible,
rise in crime once.
Is it possible that some of the rhetoric about defunding the police and actually reducing police capability has created some of the problems?
I just don't know. There are a lot of factors here, of course, the biggest one being the pandemic, and I just don't know at this point how to disaggregate.
So you think the pandemic's more of a root cause than declaring war on the police?
No, sir, I don't know. I honestly don't know.
But do you think that's a possibility, that we have gone too far in reducing police capability? Is that a possibility?
I think I gave the answer to Senator Collins, and I'd give the same one, which I think it is this Justice Department, this administration does not believe in defunding the police.
Okay.
We believe in supporting the police. We also believe that community policing is very important, and developing trust between the community and the police department is essential to stop violent crime. And we also think that includes holding police accountable. Who violate.
I agree with all that.
I know you do. I know.
We want to work with you on police reform. But I guess it's pretty obvious to me that there's been a pushback to this defunding the police. It hasn't worked, that the effort to marginalize police forces has gone too far. And I think we're seeing the results of that. And if we don't change our rhetoric in some parts of the country, it's going to get worse. Let's talk a little bit about immigration. In the end of 2020, we had an historic 45-year low of illegal crossings into this country. Now we have historic highs of illegal crossings in this country. What do you think's happened in the last 6 months?
Well, once again, you're asking me a question that I'm no expert on.
Okay.
but there was a pandemic, and that makes a difference in this area. I'm not willing to ascribe the difference to the pandemic.
Let me ask you
I
something
don't
a little
know
bit-
the answer.
right,
There are a lot of
right.
factors going on here.
How many asylum claim backlogs do we have?
We have 1.5 million backlogs in the immigration courts as of the day I took office.
Would you agree with me that the asylum system in this country is completely broken?
I would agree that the immigration system as a whole is broken.
I'm talking about asylum in general.
Yeah. I don't know. We're evaluating how we deal with asylum now.
Well, how can you have a system where you have 1.5 million backlog in cases? You now have a catch and release program regarding asylum. It seems to me that it's beyond broken. Do you agree that we should revisit our asylum policies?
I think we need to get the backlog down. That the backlog is from the preceding years, not from the new administration. I totally agree we need to get the backlog down. We need to streamline our processes.
I don't mean to belabor the point, but the backlog's not the only problem. You're going to have 1.5 million more if you don't change catch and release. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Graham. I would like to do a second round, and I know Senator Moran is interested in that as well. It's recently been disclosed that the previous administration's Justice Department seized phone records of reporters with the New York Times and the Washington Post and the phone and email logs for a CNN reporter. This is particularly salient for me, having just returned from Ukraine and Georgia, where I met with reporters from Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty who talked about the challenges they are facing in Belarus and in Russia because of efforts to threaten reporters so that they won't do their jobs and actually provide information to the public. So I understand that the department is no longer going to seize journalists' records when conducting leak investigations. And I would just ask, do you commit to ensuring freedom of the press? And can you tell us what policies are in place or you expect to be in place to ensure that there are no additional efforts to seize phone and email records of journalists unless they're involved in legitimate criminal concern?
So this is a very important issue. The President has made clear his view about the First Amendment, and it coincides with mine. It's vital to the functioning of our democracy. And that extends to the need for journalists to be able to go about their work disclosing wrongdoing and error in the government. It's part of how you get faith in a democracy is by having that level of transparency. What you were talking about, these were decisions that were made under a set of policies that have lasted. I'm not casting blame. What I want to be clear is these were under a set of policies that have existed for decades that continuously with each new administration ratcheted up greater protections. But going forward, we have adopted a policy which is the most protective of journalists' ability to do their jobs in history, and it is, as you describe, that we will not use compulsory process in leak investigations to require reporters to provide information about their sources when they're doing their job as reporters. That is going to be our policy. I'm meeting with people within the department. It's been reported that I'll be meeting with people outside the department, so I'll leave that aside for right now in order to figure out, but that is the basic policy, and that will be issued in some kind of memorandum, obviously, from me. You have a good point, which is in developing this policy, we have to distinguish between reporters doing their jobs and reporters committing crimes unrelated to the leaking. So there are some definitional questions, but I think they are quite resolvable, and that's going to be our tasks over the next few weeks.
Well, thank you very much. I want to follow up on Senator Graham's questions about the backlog in our immigration courts. And I have a question first about, which is more a clarification, because I was surprised there wasn't a budget request for the legal orientation program. As you know, this is a program that provides basic legal information and explanations of court proceedings to those who are going through immigration courts. Can you tell me if the department plans to continue this program and what the funding level will be?
Yeah. Included in our request for the Executive Office of Immigration Review, $22.5 million would continue to support that office's legal orientation program, which, LOPS, which I take it is what you're referring to. And in addition, we've requested $15 million. There'll be $15 million for a new pilot to provide access to legal representation for immigrant children. So you have our commitment that we're going to be continuing this process obviously up to the amount of money that's provided by the Congress.
Well, thank you very much. Having worked with Senator Moran several years ago when there was an effort within the Department of Justice to eliminate that program, I think it's very important that it continue. Given that the immigration courts are not independent like the federal court system, there are a lot of organizations like the Federal Bar Association who have argued that they should become Article I courts. Do you support leaving them the way they are, or would you advocate to make them a separate system?
There's an issue that I haven't thought about with respect to the sort of the way in which to structure this. I do think that the court should be as independent as possible. I understand that was the reason in the Homeland Security Act that they were taken away from INS, Immigration Naturalization Service, which went to Homeland Security, and the courts were left with the Justice Department. At one point, they were all together at the Justice Department, and that was an effort for security, for independence. And I believe that immigration judges should be left alone to do their work, and they are, of course, subject to review. The question of whether they should be Article I courts and completely independent is really a question for the Congress. I would be happy to think more about this, but obviously that would create even more independence. And so I just leave it at that. This is an issue of congressional policy.
Well, as you and Senator Graham, in your back and forth, it's very clear that we have a backlog in our immigration courts. And even though Congress has provided more money in the last few years, at least since I've been on the Appropriations Committee, we still have seen that backlog grow, not diminish. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but I do wonder if we need a fundamentally different approach. We also need immigration reform, as you pointed out. So thank you very much, Senator Moran.
As long as we're making corrections, I've been advised they kept saying a 1.5 million person case backlog. It's actually 1.3 million.
Yes, that's the number I have too. Thank you for that clarification. Senator Moran.
Attorney General, you're very good at making me feel comfortable having...
Well, I'll give you another correction. I think as soon as I said Hamilton, I think it was probably Madison. But I will check the Federalist paper that I was thinking about and get back to you on that.
That's okay. Nobody's going to know the answer to that.
Unfortunately, I feel bad about this. I should know the answer to that.
General, just a couple more questions, and I think Senator Shaheen and I will conclude this hearing. I was on the border. This is perhaps a bit of an immigration issue, but more drugs, crime, cartels issue. So I was in McAllen, Texas, not too many weeks ago to see the nature of what's going on at the border, including the detention of juveniles and listening to Border Patrol agents. But I also met with law enforcement officials, federal law enforcement officials, to talk about the aspect of our borders and the necessity of them being secure for purposes of avoiding crime, criminal activity, drug trafficking, narcotics, sexual abuse. And I just am really concerned about the Mexican cartels. I think they are probably our greatest drug trafficking threat. They continue to supply most of the cocaine, methamphetamines, heroin, fentanyl. I'm particularly concerned by the flood of methamphetamines. This Senate spends lots of time on a variety of drugs, and I sometimes think methamphetamines is overlooked as we've moved on to other drugs. But 74% of all the drug seizures in Kansas are methamphetamine. And My question is, can you describe the threat that you see posed by Mexican cartels, in particular the cross-border trafficking of drugs? But I also would expand that question to see if you have any comments that can provide any knowledge about the terrorism aspect or the espionage aspect of crossing the borders related to the cartels. My understanding is that Chinese come to the United States really at every opportunity to steal our secrets, to ingrain themselves into our economy, our science, our universities. Is there knowledge about cartels in relationship with Chinese who come to infiltrate and steal our secrets and work at NASA and SpaceX and universities? Are you aware of that?
So I'm not aware, I don't in any way mean to suggest it's not true. I just don't have any information. I think this is the kind of thing we'll have to get staffed and possibly from the FBI to come back to you. The connection that I do know about is that precursor chemicals coming from China are shipped to Mexico and then made into the narcotics that are then shipped into the United States. So there is that connection, and I think that's pretty well known. But the question you're asking, I just don't know the answer.
Well, perhaps my question, which was overly wordy, but is really a statement about the need for the Department of Justice, federal law enforcement in all arenas to increase the efforts at the border to diminish the role that cartels, Mexican cartels, play in the United States.
I think they are extraordinarily dangerous. They have lethal weaponry, sometimes exceeds what the Mexican military has, as we've seen in some of the shootouts in Mexico.
Have you had, I can't remember, I think you talked about visiting with attorney generals from other countries.
With Mexico,
Did that include Mexico?
I did. Yes, yes.
And a sense of cooperation?
Yes. He agreed on the need for cooperation. We had a very good talk. Yes.
Okay. My second, I think, final question, Madam Chair, is before your confirmation, you and I spoke just a few days before. We spoke about the need to ensure that small and rural law enforcement agencies have a fair shot at DOJ grants. Right. And in Kansas, I just want to highlight this for you. In Kansas, a smaller rural department may only have a handful, 2 or 3 or 4 sworn officers. They don't have the resources to hire a professional grant writer. They can't simply take 1/5 of their force off the beat without putting public safety at risk. I would continue to believe it's essential that the department consider ways to ensure that small and rural law enforcement agencies have access to the funding opportunities that the Department of Justice provides. And so, General Garland, I expect you would answer this question yes, but will you commit to making it a priority within the Office of Justice Programs and the COPS office to promote access for small rural agencies?
Yes, and as I told you in our conversation, it's obvious to me the problem that you point out. If you have 5 officers, you don't have anybody who runs the grant-making department or the grant application department. We also have the same problem with respect to small community organizations that don't have the ability to do funding. And I think some of the funds we have available now for OJP is to make it more easy access to applications online. And it seems to me obvious that we should be able to transfer that kind of ability for police departments as well, if that's not already in train. But I will look into it for you.
Thank you. I think when we met on that day, I asked you if you would agree to come to Kansas, and you said yes. But if I say yes to you, I have to say yes to every other senator who asked me. So when no one is listening, I'm going to ask you again.
That's fair. The Assistant Attorney General for the Office of for the Justice Management Division pointed out that the money I was thinking of is $7 million for rural law enforcement for this purpose. So
yes, sir.
There is money for that.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you, Senator Moran. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Moran, and Mr. Attorney General. Great to see you. First of all, I support many of the provisions in your budget and appreciate its overall framework. I especially want to mention the Community Violence Intervention Initiative. I look forward to working with you in the department as you implement that. As you know, there are some programs that have been more successful than others, and I think you would agree we want to focus on best practices, and I'd like to share with you in the department some that have been successful in Baltimore, if you would agree to that.
Absolutely.
You've also talked about some funding to help states and local jurisdictions that want to move forward with red flag provisions or gun licensing laws, permit to purchase. Johns Hopkins University has studied this area carefully, especially with respect to permit to purchase requirements, and I hope you will consider putting out a model proposal for local jurisdictions that are interested for permit to purchase, as I think you're suggesting you're going to do for the red flag laws. Is that something that you would consider doing?
Definitely. We did put out the red flag laws just this week, or earlier this week. But that's definitely something to consider, and I hadn't thought about it.
In terms of a model permit to purchase. In fact, I've introduced legislation here. We'd love to work with you to see if that's something you think would be a good model going forward.
Yeah.
You've probably seen some of the recent stories regarding accountability in federal law enforcement officers. And a little over a year ago, I wrote to the FBI regarding implementation of the use of force database. The Washington Post reported that in 2019, only 27% of law enforcement agencies contributed information through that process, covering about 41% of officers. You know, in my discussions with law enforcement, they all agree that more transparency and more accountability is good for everybody. And I'm assuming you agree with that premise.
Yes, I do.
So we did recently see that while we encourage local jurisdictions to provide this information, and it is voluntary, that not all federal law enforcement agencies provide this information. I hope you would agree that we should lead by example, and I would just like to get your commitment here today that all federal law enforcement agencies that come under your jurisdiction will report this data.
I didn't know we weren't reporting, so this follows the same problem with respect to body-worn cameras. When I first got in and learned that we were not wearing them, I asked why not, and I directed our Deputy Attorney General to resolve that issue. And she's very prompt, and this week we did resolve that issue. So let me put that to her as well, and this will require a meeting of the various law enforcement agencies, and we'll get on that.
I appreciate that, and it may also include federal law enforcement agencies under the jurisdiction of other departments. But as the Attorney General, if you could just agree that you'll reach out to your other agencies.
You want to authorize me to demand that
I would like to deputize you to do that.
There's a statute you could add. That would be great.
But I do think, I think many of us clearly wrongly assumed that since the federal government was asking state and local jurisdictions to do this, that we already were doing it within the federal government. So I think it's really important we do. You mentioned the body cameras. Let's make sure we do it with the data as well. The other thing I do want to mention, we're having ongoing discussions between the House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. But one of the things that I think we've seen on a bipartisan basis is there are many times when somebody calls 911 where a law enforcement response is neither justified or appropriate. Many cases, as you begin to look at 911 calls, involve mental health situations where there's no crime involved, substance use situations, and you know, I know you've proposed better training for police in terms of behavioral health. That's fine, but a number of us have proposed creating alternative responses to those many cases that involve mental health situations, and allow law enforcement, therefore, to focus on those situations where, you know, a use of force, you know, may be required. Could you work with us to create those alternative response mechanisms?
Yes, the answer is yes. I completely agree with you that alternative response mechanisms can decrease the risk of a violent confrontation when none is necessary and lead to death. We do have $40 million in this budget for the purpose of mental health collaborations, and another $10 million for training a police-based response to people with mental illness. So we have a basis for grants for this kind of program.
I appreciate that. Congresswoman Karen Bass and I have introduced legislation last Congress, and we're going to reintroduce it shortly. So we look forward to working with you on that.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. We'll go to Senator Braun next. I'm sorry, Senator Haggerty, he beat you here.
I'll stay long enough, don't worry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Attorney General,
Yes, sir.
over the past 3 months, I think the FBI has done a diligent job in pursuing those that breached the Capitol, including to the extent of, visiting their homes, tracking phone records, and all of that. Curious, we had that incident occur that was horrific to anybody. What has been done in a similar light where you look at Antifa, BLM activists that were, active in so many places across the country this past summer? Has that same diligence and effort been applied there? And I think when you add up the number of individuals involved, it would be a lot. I'm just curious to see what your approach is there and what your thinking is there.
Okay, I think that's a perfectly fair question. The events that you're talking about all took place long before I was at the Justice Department, so I was not there for the purpose of organizing the response, supervising the response, figuring out how many people should be involved in the response. As far as I understand, in terms of the arrests and the investigations, they're largely completed, and long before I got here. The January 6th event occurred the day, I think, before my nomination, and as you can imagine, it's burned on my mind, and I promised that I would focus on that, and I have. And so I can account for my behavior with respect to the way we organized the January 6th response. I am sure that the Justice Department last summer was equally diligent with respect to the response to the civil unrest at that time. I'm advised that we've spent $48 million in FBI, BOP, marshals, and ATF during that period, not counting the January 6th expenditures.
In other words, related to the riots and so forth across the country.
I'm going to describe it as civil unrest because
okay.
riot has a legal connotation, but yes.
And then how many arrests were made?
I don't know the answer.
If you could
Absolutely.
get that back to our office, I think many would want to make sure that
of course.
There's a fair response in both endeavors.
Not a problem. Be happy to get back to you.
I'm ranking member on the Ledge Branch Subcommittee, where we've got to figure out resources that we're going to devote to securing the Capitol, making sure that Capitol Police are getting the resources they need. On the building itself, we spoke to the architect of the Capitol that said there were close to $30 million in damages done. That seems like a lot because especially in relation to something that came out of the Justice Department, in an article at the Washington Post that tabbed it at $1.5 million. Are you aware of that?
I saw that number. Okay. I was also surprised. I don't know what they were calculating that as a basis of. I guess this had something to do with what the restitution for individuals might be. But I don't know. I don't have any reason to doubt the larger number that you mentioned.
So those are two very divergent figures.
Yes, they are, and I will, when I get back to the office, see if we can figure out.
I appreciate finding out what your official version is, and then we'll compare it to that.
Very good.
The declassified intelligence report on the domestic violence extremism released by the DNI in March identified abortion-related violent extremists as a principal threat. To me, this seemed like kind of a wild attack on the pro-life community. Did not list groups like BLM and Antifa, who have had a clear recent record of violent acts. So can you explain what that was about, why there would have been focus on that, and has there been a rash of incidents related to it?
So I'm going to have to refresh my recollection about the report. It was, what the report described as the leading threats were racially motivated and ethnically motivated, ethnically motivated violent extremists. That was, and particularly white supremacists. That was the number one threat. I think that the anti-abortion is an area. I don't have any, to be honest, I don't know what the, where that fits in the threat matrix as to how high it is at this point. It's not my understanding that it is one of the ones that was listed at the high end of threat, but we can get back to you on where that's.
If you would, please. And I think the point being that if it seems like there's a disproportionate interest or emphasis on one category and not the other, it's going to raise some eyebrows and then also bring into the question of, is that effort being applied fairly across the board?
Yes, and so in addition to the category of racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, there is a separate category of anti-government or anti-authority violent extremists, and this would be where some of the anarchists that you were just talking about would fall into that bucket. And that's another an area of focus of the FBI.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Braun. Senator Haggerty.
Chair Shaheen, thank you. And looks like Ranking Member Moran has left, but General Garland, I appreciate your staying for a little bit longer.
Of course.
And thank you for being here to testify today. I'd like to follow up on just a bit of your discourse with Senator Moran for a moment. I would like to follow up on something that you had discussed with Senator Shaheen. But with respect to Senator Moran and your conversation about working with your counterparts, the Attorney Generals in Mexico, I was last month with the Foreign Minister of Mexico. I went there to examine the situation on the ground. He was very clear as well that they would like to cooperate with us on law enforcement, sharing technology. They need help interdicting the fentanyl and the fentanyl precursors that are coming in from China. They have real problems there, and I applaud any efforts that you might undertake to work with their law enforcement to help them, and in particular, in border security. We went through that as well, and I think our technology and our capabilities could be helpful there. I'd like to turn to a different subject, though, and that gets back to the backlog that you're experiencing and perhaps the need for a new approach. And as Attorney General, your Executive Office for Immigration Review is charged with adjudicating claims for asylum. Human smugglers in Central America and Mexico, known as coyotes, are using our country's generous asylum laws as advertisements to draw people in to a very dangerous journey, a journey that often results in them losing their lives or becoming victims of crime. To this end, a recent Los Angeles Times report states that, quote, Mexican coyotes deposit migrants at the Rio Grande and instruct them to give themselves up to U.S. Border Patrol agents to claim asylum. This is what the coyotes are marketing. Go across the border, claim asylum. That is the secret password to get in. Asylum, fear. That seems to be the key to enter our country. General Garland, do you agree that human smugglers are taking advantage of our asylum system?
Well, I think there's no doubt that human smugglers and human traffickers are taking advantage of the people who they are smuggling. That's the reason we have just stood up a new task force, anti-human smuggling and anti-human trafficking. It will involve all the main agencies of, we call it Task Force Alpha, which just announced this week, includes cooperation with Homeland Security. We're also putting people into the northern triangle countries where the smuggling originates to try to interdict it there. We're also introducing anti-corruption units to assist those countries in ending the corruption that often leads to people going to these smuggling entities. So
and no doubt the coyotes are taking advantage of the people of the people there, but are they taking advantage of our system, our generous system of asylum?
I don't. There are a lot of motivations for people coming out of the Northern Triangle, some of which we can fix and some of which we can't, and which we're trying very hard to fix. You know, we have an obligation under our law and under international law to provide refuge under the categories that Congress has set forth for us. And people are entitled to process to seek asylum under what Congress has authorized and required.
Well, the problems with our asylum laws that you're acknowledging, I think, are clear. I applaud you're acknowledging that because we do need to address that, and I look forward to working to do that. But let's come back to the messaging that the coyotes are using to attract people into this dangerous process. Just this week in Guatemala, Vice President Harris sent a message to those that were perhaps contemplating coming to our country illegally: do not come. Is that a message that you can deliver, Attorney General, sitting right there, a message to these people: do not come to our country?
Look, I think that Vice President Harris has been very deeply involved in the kind of law enforcement and other requirements that we're looking to set up. She was instrumental in moving us to establish this joint task force to de-incentivize and to reduce traffic from the Northern Triangle countries down through Mexico and into the United States. So there are a lot of different messaging kind of issues involved, and some of them involve getting at the root causes of why people are leaving in those countries.
Well, messaging is one of these root causes, and I think it would be incredibly important to hear from our top law enforcement officer in America that these people should not come.
Well, I don't want people to make the very difficult and dangerous trip with coyotes that you're talking about. There's no doubt about that, that this leads to human tragedy.
Well, if these people enter our country illegally, are you willing to say that they will be deported?
So the question of asylum is one that our law permits them to make claims of asylum and to have an opportunity to show whether they have the grounds for it or not. If they're not entitled to asylum, then they're deported. I want to be clear, that element is for the Department of Homeland Security. It's not for the Justice Department. What we do is adjudicate the asylum claim.
Well, I'll come back and say this. According to the data on the Justice Department website, 90% plus of the people that come here under the claim of asylum are found to be invalid claims. And in that circumstance, would you be willing to say if a person comes here, goes through the asylum process, and it's found that their claim is invalid and they should be removed, that they will be deported?
The Department of Homeland Security is responsible for that issue. They have, because of the large numbers that you're talking about, they, I understand, have a series of priorities. First and most important, deportation of people who are at risk for national security to the United States and for public safety. I think, and lastly, they're trying to deport recent arrivals in order to send the message that you're talking about, that people not come. So
I was with you and Secretary Mayorkas when we went through this prioritization before. I'm shocked at what he said, because the number of people coming across our border illegally has massively increased, yet the number of deportations has gone way down. So I'm not buying that argument. What I would love to hear you say, as our nation's top law enforcement official, in a way that would instruct the Department of Homeland Security, is that it is illegal to cross the border into this country, that if somebody is found to have failed in their claim for asylum, which 90% of the people do, that they will be deported. That's the message that people in these countries need to hear. Not that, well, don't come, but if you do, there's nothing going to happen to you about it.
It's a misdemeanor to cross the border without the appropriate documentation. That's correct. And the question of rights to apply for asylum is also correct. That's an element of our law. The determination of how to deport and what priorities, that's up to the Department of Homeland Security, and I don't think it useful for me to get into their business with respect to their, any more than I would expect them to get into our business with respect to our law enforcement priorities.
Well, I would hope for a clear determination that when someone is found to be applying for asylum here in an invalid fashion, that they should leave this country and that they will be deported. The fact that you're not able to say that clearly today and send that message to the Department of Homeland Security is shocking.
If they've been adjudicated to not be entitled to asylum, then they should be deported. Yes.
I appreciate you saying that. I applaud that, because that's the message that needs to be conveyed right now.
I'm sorry, maybe I didn't understand the question, but of course, once they've been adjudicated, then of course they should be deported.
I think we need to be
Thank
very
you,
clear
Senator
about that.
Hagerty.
Thank you, Chair.
Time has expired. If there are any further questions for the record, senators have until June 16th to submit those, and we would request that the department respond within 30 days. Thank you very much, Attorney General Garland, for appearing today and for your willingness to take all of our questions.
Of course.
Let me also announce that we will stand in recess until Tuesday, June 15th, when we will hold a hearing on NASA's budget request. The hearing's adjourned.
Thank you.